SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership presents its podcast series called Past Imperfect.
You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. One of the greatest challenges for any teacher of South Asian history is how to recover female voices. Most of our sources are written by and about elite men. But traces of female power and agency are there if you dig below the surface. In this episode, Priya Atwal speaks about Royals and Rebels, her remarkable new book on the Sikh Empire. Atwal demonstrates that royal women were key architects of the Sikh Empire, managing estates, advising and tutoring princes and maharajas, and even coordinating the logistics of military campaigns. Rani Jindan, Ranjit Singh's last queen, is the best known of these women. But Atwal shows that her daring and pluck came from a much longer history of female power in Punjab. Thank you, Priya, for being here today in order to talk about your book, Royals and Rebels. Your book gives us remarkable insight into how the Sikh Empire was more than just beyond Ranjit Singh, how princes and especially women played a definitive role in the management of the empire. Can you tell us a little bit about how you embarked upon this particular project?
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast, first of all. It's lovely to be here. And I guess in answer to your question, I initially was particularly interested in one Maharani in particular, Maharani Jindgaur, supposedly the last queen of the Sikh Empire. And my interest in her was piqued as an undergraduate student. I was probably only about 18 or 19 at the time. And to my embarrassment, I grew up quite woefully ignorant about Sikh and Punjabi history, despite coming from a British Sikh family. And it was a talk at the University Sikh Society that a friend of mine had organised in my first year at university, where a speaker came along to talk about a book called The Empire of the Sikhs by Patwant Singh and Jyoti Rai, which had just launched that year. We're talking 2009, I believe. And essentially, I heard the story of this former Sikh Raj and was absolutely fascinated by it, immediately bought a copy. But the speaker had these very, the speaker had these very mixed views about the Maharani, and actually quite negative, to say the role that she played in the downfall of the empire and all this kind of stuff. But some of the things that he was describing her as having done were actually quite remarkable and really, really blew my mind that, this young woman had been doing all this at this time. And so I became interested in delving into the gender history of her reign as an undergraduate student, and decided then later on to pursue that further as a doctoral thesis topic. And as I, initially was setting out to write a thesis on the kind of mother-son triangle between Queen Victoria, Maharaja Dalip Singh, who was the Maharani's son, but the last Maharaja of the Punjab at that time, and the Maharani herself, I started to delve into the world of the Lahore Darbar in the 19th century. And, suddenly you start going, as you do as a doctoral candidate, you go through lots and lots of sources and you try and hone your thesis. And all of these incredible other women and queens and princes were coming to view in the sources that I was reading. And it was clear that the Maharani, in a way, was no exception. She was part of a lineage of women who had, not just in Punjab, but all over South Asia at that time, had played really interesting political and cultural roles. And so, I was captured by that history, and eventually decided that the book that I wanted to write, which I was initially thinking would be a biography on the Maharani, needed to be a study of this.
From colonial times to the present, especially through mediums like Bollywood, Punjabi culture has been defined as being quite macho and manly, masculine. And your book certainly gives us some examples of that. I mean, you talk about, for example, how Prince Kharak Singh was sent out into battle to capture a fort at the age of 7, right? Which sounds incredible. But your book obviously challenges so many of these notions. If you could talk a little bit about, how you add a gendered perspective, not just to Punjabi history, but also to Indian history in general, and why it's important, of course.
Well, yes. I mean, it's such a problematic construct that Sikhs were a martial race, that we are a martial race, for example. And it's fascinating how it's such a good question, in popular culture that's taken such a hold. I mean, Akshay Kumar must have made millions out of Singh is King and all of this kind of trope in a way, which is
Terrible
not just
movie,
the
also.
well, yeah, exactly. Not just the kind of martial trope, but the royal thing as well, but
Yeah.
in a highly commercialized fashion. And it takes away some of the real kind of colonial tragedy of this history in a way as well. That the Sikh community was then had their kind of their sort of very saintly and quite radical political tradition of being warriors diminished into this kind of colonial servitude, and that was enhanced by the fact that so much military labor was drawn from the Punjab in order to keep some of the areas of rural poverty at bay. So many soldiers, not just Sikhs from Punjab, but Punjabis, Muslims, and others, willingly joined the army, especially in the Second World War, to really try and make ends meet. And that has created a very and it kind of turbocharged the more patriarchal elements of Punjabi society in many ways. And but essentially, I think what I wanted to delve into in the book is alternative, older notions of gender relations and masculinity and female power that were clearly prevalent in the Punjab in the 19th century. And I play with this through some of the sources that I looked at that were artwork. There are paintings of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which are today in the Victoria and Albert Museum's collections and other places, the Royal Collection, because so much was taken from the Lahore Doshakana and taken to Britain in 1849 when the kingdom was annexed. Yeah, so actually growing up in the UK, I got to see some of this stuff, but didn't ever understand what it was referring to or what it meant until I did my PhD. But in those paintings, you see Maharaja Ranjit Singh, wearing these incredibly beautiful floral outfits and in these garden scenes with soldiers, and none of them are showing a talwar, none of them are showing a kirpan or a sword openly, and that I found fascinating because that's one of the 5Ks, the Panchakaka, that we understand of a Khalsa identity, of a kirpan, a sword. But they wear their martial identity and their masculinity in a somewhat more reserved fashion, right? And they emphasize the softer power, if you see what I mean, that they're bringing a sense of flourishment to the world through their rule. And instead you see Ranjit Singh holding onto a rose, a flower of some sort, or even a document, a text, is to represent his governance. And similarly, I was fascinated by the queens and how they exercise their power because, he, as I kept an Excel spreadsheet of all of the wives that he married, literally I had to. There was no other way to tabulate all this data that was coming through.
It's complex data.
It is what it is, because if finally, I didn't expect it to get that complex, but as I was going through colonial records and Punjabi courtly records of this period, all these women kept popping up, and there was details that went with them of where they were married, where they were brought up, where they owned land, what kind of pensions were given to their families on the point of marriage, and what role they played. And then when they died, and maybe what kind of children they had, how many boys or girls, etc., etc. So in the end, I did need an Excel spreadsheet to kind of pull this together, and it helped me to analyze, what was going on with them, and I published that spreadsheet effectively as the appendices of the book with the list of all of the women associated with the dynasty that I was able to find, and that's the first time, apart from in these sources, that those women have been brought together in the historical record in that way. And what I wanted to do was really shine a light on who they are, but make their details known for researchers to then be able to go away and do more work. And what we see from that also is that not all of these women came from elite backgrounds. They came from all over northern India as it was then, on the borders with Pathan tribes, or from Kashmir, as well as all over Punjab and the Pahari regions. And they were not just Sikh, they were Hindu and Muslim. Ranjit Singh even joked about marrying an English wife at one stage. Never quite managed to make it happen. But what I just, and then I took that Excel spreadsheet. You're going to laugh even more now, Dinyar, but I put it into a Google map, right? I started plugging this one day when I was struggling writing a chapter. I plotted all their location information into a Google map. And I was astounded, because what you see is how the marriage kind of map, in a way, the politics of how Ranjit Singh went about marrying these women. When you see it plotted out in a map, you see how over time he moved from marrying women amongst the kind of Sikh Punjabi heartlands of central and western Punjab out to the fringes of his empire, and then also arranged marriages for his sons in a similar fashion, and how that built this web of this family's rising imperial power, and how the women weren't just integral for the matchmaking that went on, but also then for the roles that their families played in all these local communities to, I suppose, build a foundation for Ranjit Singh's growing Raj. So, really, women are integral to the building of this empire and its maintenance. And if we just take a little bit more time to scratch under the surface, there's just so much to be found.
That's interesting that you talk about, using Google Maps and Excel sheets and such. I'm sure, back in the day, these tools would have been of great help to the British, because I know that, at least, from studying a bit about Western India with regard to Baroda, there were similar attempts to kind of compile a history of the family. And I can't remember right now how detailed the data was on the women, but definitely the family trees that were built up were, huge and massive and complex. And in my own dissertation, I recall using Google Maps to, do something different, talk about the geographical spread of correspondence of the particular individuals I was looking at, and see how they mapped across parts of the UK and parts of Europe. So, I mean, these tools have really helped us in many ways. And I like how your book brings that up also, how you through marriage, he really tied together, Ranjit Singh and his heirs really tied together so many different elements of his growing empire. And of course, you began your book with talking about a marriage, right? And how it's really important in Punjabi culture and of course in the construction of this particular empire as well.
Yes, I mean, well, we all know, don't we, how important marriage is in South Asian culture. You can't escape for a shadi going on somewhere. And I mean, I joked with my family that, the writing of this book was in many ways bookended by weddings. My cousin got married, Lakshmi, who's like a sister to me, and then my brother was getting married just as it was being released, and it was actually the preparations for my cousin's wedding that enabled me to kind of have the inspiration for her rukka, for to give me the inspiration for the opening of the book, the introduction, because I thought, well, how better to introduce this dynamic cast of a family of all these powerful characters, but through a wedding. But also it was so powerfully evident within the courtly sources, particularly the favoured court historian Sohan Lal Suri of Ranjit Singh, that these weddings were clearly designed. Ranjit Singh's own marriages, the weddings of his elder son Garak Singh, the next heir, and then his grandson, the second heir to the throne, Nonihal Singh, that these were designed to be political occasions. And I think we can all intuitively think about how that works in our own families. It's that we need to put on a grand show for all of our guests. This goes to the heart of how the family is an important political space within South Asian culture, and not just within South Asian culture. We're not somehow unique or other because of that. We have power relations within our family dynamics in many different ways. But this the wedding that I opened the book with, Nona Halsting's wedding, was perhaps the grandest occasion that the Punjabi dynasty put on at this time, alongside some of the great meet and greets between the Maharaja and the various governors general that come to visit him in the Punjab in the 1830s, Lord Bentinck and Lord Auckland. But this is where we see, I think, an amazing kind of networking within the family to solidify their bonds, and that's where the queens often take charge in the more traditional customs, the maya, the jago, the kind of all of the fun that goes on, celebrating the boy's marriage before the formal ceremonies begin. But then you also see, and this is what I opened the book with, how Ranjit Singh rolls out the carpet for visiting company dignitaries. and in a way attempts to bring them into his family in an interesting kind of way. And that was also something that I wanted to highlight in the book, and this is why I refer to Maharaja Ranjit Singh's rulership as being kind of grounded in ideas of dynastic colonialism. And I took that term from two historians who work on the early modern Dutch kingdom, the House of Orange Nassau, Jacqueline van Gent and Susan Broomhall, who use that phrase to refer to how a ruling house attempts to bolster its power by, engaging in these kind of soft power networks of exchanging really, valuable gifts from different colonial territories amongst themselves to kind of negotiate power, to kind of share ideas about their status and their colonial power, and to kind of symbolically demonstrate this within their homes, but also to send off different younger members of the family to become ambassadors or political governors or that kind of thing in different territories, not only within their immediate kingdom, but also further afield in the world. And that's exactly what we see happening in the way that Ranjit Singh sends off his sons from as young as 6, as you mentioned earlier, to go and no one was saying that they were going to conquer forts, but they were there as the kind of nominal head in charge of the campaign to represent his family, his leadership, right? His missile, as it was at the time. And then you see this within these celebratory occasions as well, how, but this is part of the fabric of that political culture of that time. And it's a kind of, in a way, an outgrowth of what the Mughals had done earlier with the notion of the kilat, that you give, a really beautiful gift of clothing and horses and whatnot and swords and all sorts, but you're essentially binding the receiver into the person, the body of the ruler, right? Or the person who's attempting to pose as the sovereign. And in this way, Ranjit Singh takes those ceremonies and continues with them even further. But he tries to bind the British into his kinship networks as well in an interesting way. But they're very anomalous, right? The company is not a family. It's an enterprise, a rapacious one. So it's a really fraught thing, but a very creative political experiment, I thought.
We can certainly see ways that ceremony continues to play a very important political role here, right? In India, when reading your descriptions of the wedding of Nihal Singh, I immediately thought of, say, the Ambani weddings here in Bombay a few years ago, and how they were very public demonstrations of power and wealth, and how they continue to be. I mean, Ambani built a house for, I think, his daughter and son-in-law right on one of the prominent sea faces. So anytime you go past it, that's the biggest house you see. So it's kind of like a lasting symbol to this particular marriage. And of course, I think especially under the current government in India, you see how spectacle and ceremony has really become, really important as kind of these totemic signs of power.
I mean, absolutely. And I think in that sense, the older performances of royalty and dynasty have gone nowhere. India
Absolutely.
may be a republic today, but the trappings and the cultural performances of elites maintain those older forms of practice, don't they? And before, of course, BJP and the Modi and everyone else has come to power, we had a dynasty ruling in India or governing in India with the Congress party and the Gandhi family, the Nehru Gandhi family. So it's interesting how we've gone through a sort of transition with that political, process, and much of that earlier culture is still part and parcel of South Asian politics. And it's a similar case in Pakistan in many ways still, right? So, it's not just in India. And I think, and this is why I think I was really quite interested in returning to a study of royal or elite history, if we put those, terms in quotation marks, because in order to understand, in some ways, some of the dimensions of political culture that remains with us, I mean, and this is, again, actually, I would say not just, linked to South Asia. Look at Britain. We still have a monarchy over here. The Queen obviously passed away this year, but we have continued straight into the reign now of King Charles. And the big drama in the UK right now is the response to Harry and Meghan's, series on Netflix and the light that shines on the power of the monarchy and the media around this and how it's centered on a marriage that went wrong. So I think actually, I think it's important. Maybe, one could see this as a departure from, the focus on subaltern studies and marginalized histories and that kind of thing. But I don't think it necessarily is. I think actually we need to think about how these different fields intersect with each other, and how actually we need to continue to break down the studies of royal culture and elites and that kind of thing in order to understand how that power is mobilized and continues to play an important part in our societies and our politics today, alongside paying greater attention to the vast majority of non-elite voices.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest criticisms I have for subaltern studies, at least my own opinion, while acknowledging that it obviously plays a very important role in kind of realigning our perspectives in history, is that at the end of the day, ultimately, elites do matter, and they especially matter in a place like India. I mean, India is one of the most top-down societies in the world, and you are looking at Sikh royalty in the early 1800s. I was looking in my own dissertation at nationalists in the late 19th century in places like Western India. Records survive of these individuals for a reason, and they don't survive for other people, because the culture in South Asia, for better or worse, and mostly for worse, unfortunately, is so elite based and so elite driven, and we can't ignore that. I mean, we can problematize it, we can break it down, but we have to pay attention to it.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated picture, isn't it? And I think with the way that Sikh sovereignty evolved, and this is something that I want to kind of, or at least the practical operation of Sikh sovereignty in Punjab in the 19th century, something that drew me to it, and something that I'm continuing to ponder, is how it went from a model of very radically diffuse sovereignty spread across the whole panth, the whole community, as explained in the ideas of the gurus, right, to being vested in one king and one family, and how even in the 1840s, against all the odds, what we regard as the Khalsa army, but also the representatives of the Khalsa as a whole, continued to prop that family on the throne, and how, even though we don't necessarily, and this is a frustrating thing, we don't have records for those ordinary people in Punjab, be it Sikhs or Muslims or whoever else, that the royal family were ruling over. We can only get at their voices through these elite sources and the elite representations of them. I mean, I'm also thinking of the way in which Abhishek Kekar has recently produced a brilliant book on popular sovereignty in early modern India in the Mughal era. And he has again tried to get at the voices of ordinary citizens in Delhi through reading, elite Mughal sources against the grain in different kinds of ways. And we could therefore we can only get so far, but we can get to, and it's some very interesting dynamics, and we can keep kind of knocking away at that. But it's looking at this interplay between elite and ordinary, subject histories that we can tease out some of the tensions, at least, because what for me is clear is that the Sikh royal family that was in power in the 1840s, so in the era of Gorakh Singh, Nonhal Singh, and the rest of the family, they were in power at the pleasure of the Khalsa army and ordinary other Punjabi citizens, right? So, and they could have easily been swept away in that period of time. And I think that's fascinating. And I really want to kind of come back to that later on to investigate that further. But it also bears down later on when Maharaja Dalip Singh, the last Maharaja, as an adult, tries to rebel against the British Raj and regain his kingdom. And this is something I'm at very early stages of thinking about. And there's going to be an important, hopefully, monograph also coming out on this topic by Rajbir Singh Judge from the States. I think the two of us are trying to think through what Sikh sovereignty evolved into or within the community by the late 19th century, when you've started to have the rise of the Singh Sabha movement. You've had British missionaries, meddling in the religious politics, and some Sikhs are starting to think about, well, what could independence look like for us? How do we restore our lost Raj and all the rest of it? And Dalip Singh crops up again and wants to restore his rule. And how does he, and it's a question of how does he come back into the fold after having been in Britain for 20 odd years and having converted into a Christian? How does he kind of resurrect his sovereignty? And where does his individual sovereignty as a king stand against the wider notion of this shared notion of sovereignty amongst the people of the Panth, essentially? And with the notion of Raj Karega Khalsa, that the Khalsa shall rule, but also that means that the Khalsa as a collective entity rather than just one person. And so we can see essentially that you have competing notions of power and how, whether they are linked to an individual, an elite individual, or whether they are linked to a collective body of people and shared, and how those run at the same time as each other. And that was what I was trying to play with and think about in this book, that these notions coexist within Ranjit Singh's Punjab, that he is continually conscious that he can only push his power so far. You know, he rules, his government is known as the Sarkar-e Khalsa, the government of the Khalsa. It's not, but nevertheless, it operates as this imperial dynasty. So it's this delicate dance. And this is again, not just something linked to the Punjab only, but it's going on within broader South Asia, particularly pre-colonial South Asia, you know, throughout time. But I find that fascinating, right? This delicate dance that these kings do with their subjects, with their god as well, you know, to think about the best way to exercise their sovereignty that doesn't fall into tyranny in a way. And I think that's still very relevant to today's politics in many ways.
Absolutely. So this actually leads me to what all of what you've talked about leads me to the next question I had, which was, could you tell us a little bit about how Sikh notions of kingship changed over time? I mean, you spoke a little bit about, you know, notions of the Khalsa and the Sarkari Khalsa and such like that, but how do we get to a moment where Ranjit Singh is, in some senses, modeling himself on Mughal precedents, but in other senses, really innovating in terms of, you know, who a king should be in the South Asian world?
Right. Well, so we go back a step then in a way. So we start off with the gurus, Guru Nanak in the 15th century, and Guru Nanak is, you know, alive and witnesses the period of Babur's invasion of northern India, and the complete change that takes place with that. And so the kind of Sikh guruship period and the rise of the Mughals goes hand in hand. And of course you have, you know, especially in popular history, of really kind of fraught antagonistic understanding of what this relationship meant between the Sikhs and the Mughals. And and understandably so, with the kind of you know, killings of the gurus, the wars that go on, and so on, as well as the killing of Guru Gobind Singh's children. Now, notwithstanding, you know, not forgetting any of that, you know, it's clear that even the gurus themselves would have given a more nuanced picture of their relationship with the Mughal dynasty and their rule, because of course we have, you know, ample evidence of how, for example, Guru Arjan was friendly with Akbar, and how Akbar was involved with the initial creation of Ramdaspur and then Amritsar, and later on how Guru Gobind Singh was supportive of some of the princely politics of Aurangzeb's sons, as, you know, essentially that they were, you know, cognizant of the Mughals as the political kingly powers of the time, and how they engaged with their kind of shifting power relations, but how they also nevertheless carved a space politically for themselves within the Punjab and northern India as a whole. And so this is within Gurbani, within writings of the gurus, we see so much meditation, not just on the name of God, but or Vaheguru, or of the meaning of what a Sikh should be, but on power and how that plays out in the world that we live in, the temporal world, and also how that plays out within a spiritual realm. You know, that there's a notion of really that the true power in this universe is the Sacha Padshah, which is Vaheguru, or the divine, and that anything that any mortal being does is obviously going to be eventually subsumed into this divine, and there's nothing we can do about it, and the ultimate thing to do is to accept this and realize this. And therefore, if you're blessed with sovereignty or power in this life, you should do something worthwhile with it, essentially, but not get too arrogant and greedy about it. And it's these really, fascinating kind of moral, ethical discussions in Gurbani that I found really intriguing, because, there are these really important meditations on how power should operate, how society should operate, and how people should relate to each other, and this, wider divine universal entity that is not just up there in the clouds, but is also within all of us, right? And the really radical implications that has, that, okay, if the Sacha Badshah is the true ruler, but that Sacha Badshah is, in a way, and they use lots of different metaphors to explain this, but one of the ones I find the most useful is this sense of a shared light, a light that is present in everyone and everything. If that light of royalty and sovereignty and divinity is present in us all, then where does power really lie? Is the question that they pose. And that therefore the gurus are set up. And you see this really beautifully in the Shabads of Guru Arjan when he writes about Amritsar, which I quote in the book. He talks about the guru as the servant of the people, then, really, that by serving all of his devotees and disciples, he is actually then serving the divine, right? So there's an inversion, and he talks specifically about washing the feet of the people that come to Amritsar, which, of course, an Indian king at that time would never have done, right? Of course, and it's the ultimate, that they are the servant of the people. So, there's this notion of kingship that is diffused then throughout the people, but at the same time that Sikh writers and contributors to the Guru Granth Sahib, as well as the nascent historians of the Panth and that kind of thing, they start revering the gurus as kingly figures, right? So there's this kind of mirroring process going on, and then by the 18th century you see paintings of the gurus being produced in the kind of new small princely courts that are being established by a rising class of Sikh noblemen who, after the death of Guru Gobind Singh, are in charge of sections of the Khalsa army, which we come to know as the Missals, the kind of warrior bands that are established under him, but which defend the Sikh community in the very rocky years of the early 18th century from Afghan invasion, especially, as well as local Punjabi kind of persecution to suppress the increasing wealth of this one. And in those new courts that start popping up, where you have these kind of Sikh generals, in a way, of the former Guru Gobind Singh's army, now becoming increasingly powerful landlords and kind of barons, in a way, in different parts of the Punjab, 12 warrior bands, 12 Missals, and they start setting themselves up as kings in this transitional period. And their courts produce these really beautiful paintings of the gurus, showing them as royal figures, right? So, you see Guru Nanak often with this kind of multicolored, a bit like Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, like with these kind of really beautiful multicolored cloak. You could tell I brought up in the UK for my references, but always with a tree over his head, right? And to kind of mimic the sense of a canopy that a Mughal or an Indo-Persian ruler would have, in their courtly setup. And Guru Gobind Singh, you will always often have with a steed, riding into battle or riding into a hunting scenario, as the warrior prince in many ways, and with a galgi, right? So clearly representing him as a warrior prince, and then as a embodiment of sovereignty. And so there's a shift that's taking place within the Sikh imagination about what their gurus were representing, and therefore what kind of sovereignty they can claim for themselves. And then comes Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who essentially is the consolidation of all of this, shifting politics. He takes over a vast majority of the Punjab from all of these different other Missals and consolidates that power within his own Missal, and which he then as we've been discussing today, transforms into a kind of an imperial dynasty. But he nevertheless, like I said just in that previous, when we were discussing that previous question, I think this phrase is a helpful one. He engages in this delicate dance with the powers that be amongst the kind of spiritual leadership of the Khalsa, which is still based at the Akal Takht in Amritsar, and with his people, with the soldiers of his army, with the subjects that come to the Darbar in Lahore, with the wider members of his family, and with the Guru Granth Sahib, because he makes sure to read from the Guru Granth Sahib every day, where he has a debate, some kind of masla going on about a political problem or a future direction. He very publicly makes a show of going to the Guru Granth Sahib and asking for guidance, and but also making sure that within his government, people of all different faith backgrounds are represented. He has lots of Muslims, lots of Hindus, different, as well as Europeans, involved in the governance of the kingdom, because he's also aware that he's now taken over a very multicultural region. So it's this playoff between these kind of older, very radical Sikh ideas of political power sharing and the realities of a Punjab that is incredibly diverse and incredibly fractured in terms of its competing political groupings, right, that he's trying to manage. And this is a crucial period in Sikh history that many people now hark back to say this was our golden era for sovereign independence, right? And of course, after 1947, from the 1920s onwards, there were calls for a Sikhistan or a Khalistan that hark back to this period in history and say, well, we had our own Raj, just like the other Indian princely states had, the Mughals, etc., etc. We deserve that space. But what I think is clear is that from all of this is that there's never really been one model of what Sikh sovereignty should look like or how it should operate. It's always been very fluid, and there have been competing notions that have coexisted at the same time of how it should operate in practice. I mean, even in the early days of these Sikh sardars or noblemen in the 18th century, when they're establishing their little fiefdoms, they're all going to Amritsar quite often and participating in these grand assemblies, the Gurmata moments, where they take the blessing of the Guru and they supposedly have to come to a power sharing agreement about how it's best to rule the Punjab in the name of all of the Sikhs, essentially. And that goes on alongside them trying to set themselves up as kings. And they're supposed to be equal to their soldiers or to their wider kin, but we see this kind of separation take place. So I think really it's fascinating how creative this period of history was and how complex it was. But I think, and I know this is work that I have kind of borrowed from an older generation of historians, especially in Sikh and Punjab studies, that have said that, actually they've counteracted a kind of common conception that has come up within popular history on the Sikhs, particularly the writings of Kushwant Singh or Patwant Singh, for example, which claim that, Sikhs are a republican community. And I agree with that older generation of scholars that probably wrote for more academic audiences that actually, no, this is definitely the case, that Sikhs have a very interesting relationship with monarchy. So much of our spiritual and political tradition is imbued with the ideas of kingship. But we've never quite settled on one model. It's always been a fluid, contested process. And in many ways, that is part and parcel of the fluidity of the politics that you're in a kind of post-Mughal South Asia, right? That's something that goes on really interestingly in the Punjab, but it goes on throughout the rest of South Asia. And even today, as we were just discussing.
Absolutely. I mean that period that you're talking about, in the post-Mughal era, when you have these successor states, you have such a variety of different experiments going on, right? I mean, from Tipu Sultan in the south to rulers in places like Awadh and Bengal, and you see all different types of power configurations being developed across the subcontinent. I mean, the one thing that I found most striking when you're talking about how our conceptions of kinghood were contested, and there was some sort of, there was a sense that the king still had some greater responsibility, or was under, I guess the lookout of the wider community, was when you describe how after Ranjit Singh married, I think, one of a dancing girl, and very publicly celebrated the wedding, he was actually summoned, right, to the Akal Takht to be castigated and threatened with being whipped, right, in order to. Yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit more about that. It's really quite a striking instance of even how someone like Ranjit Singh could, he was not superior at all.
No, it's a fascinating story. As the story goes, it's recorded by one of the leading Muslim families of his darbar at the time, the Fakir family, who were doctors, vids, as well as ambassadorial leads for his kingdom. And essentially, quite early on in his reign, Ranjit Singh falls in love with, and I can use that phrase because he, some of the colonial sources later on record quite touchingly how he speaks of this young woman. So he falls in love with a dancing girl called Mora at the Vaif, a courtesan. Well, we say a dancing girl, but actually she was more likely at the Vaif or a courtesan. And she comes from Amritsar and is highly educated, and is supposedly a striking beauty. And he's already had at least 3 marriages by this point, I believe, and had children with those wives. And he chooses to marry Mora. And yes, as I mentioned in the book, he's kind of parading her through the streets of Lahore in this kind of honeymoon phase on the back of an elephant. And they may have been having a drink or two on the way. And it's exactly that kind of antics that the sort of more religious authorities within, the Gyannis and the Bais of the Akal Takht are just not happy with, because it's not just the marriage, it's the whole kind of almost, as they would probably say, immoral display, right? Have him cavorting around with this woman. There's so many issues there. He's married like for the 4th or 5th time. He's out drinking. He's not even showing any sharam essentially. So, so they do. Yes, they're right. And there's various accounts of this story that he's summoned to the Akal Takht to apologize. And he I don't think there's ever any indication that he's meant to give up this wife. It's nothing like that. It's just the very unseemly display that he's considered to have put on, which is not at all seen as fitting for a Sikh Maharaja to be doing, and it obviously goes against the whole strictures about him being a moral, humble, temperate person, right, a responsible person. So he is summoned, and supposedly he's meant to have been punished with over 100 lashes of a whip, and he stands hat jodke, as we would say, like humbly with his hands in front of him, and says, I will take the punishment, right? So supposedly he's given 1 hit on the back, and then they forgive him, and then he pays a lot of money towards the Akal Takht and the Harmandir Sahib and all the rest of it, and then it's all forgotten. But it's interesting that some 20 years later, in I think 1832, he does a similar thing. He marries Gul Begum Bahar, another Thawaif, and he takes her out and about, and nobody says anything at that point, So there's a shift that takes place, right? And but these women became again important political figures at Lahore. They built educational institutes for Islamic scholars. They built mosques. They were political advisors to the Maharaja because they were very educated. So, there was a love marriage dimension to it, as we, I think it was Emily Eden that writes in her kind of published diaries about her travels in the Punjab that he very lovingly takes Mora's hand and takes her off a boat, and there's clear that he sees a British official do something similar for his wife, and it reminds him of how he has those moments with his wife Mora. so there's an element of this, this being an important part of the personal life of this, conquering king, that he has this very intimate relationship with one of his wives. But there's also, as I said, these political dimensions, that these women become really, really interesting players. And Gul Begum becomes one of the surviving queens, who lives on for several years in Lahore and remains an important noble figure representing the family long after Dalip Singh has gone. But yeah, in terms of the power politics, right, it is fascinating. And I think the other thing that I find fascinating is that no one stops him from marrying all these women, really. Because it's interesting that he gets summoned for cavorting with Mora, but nobody stops him from marrying so many women. And of course, that flies well in the face of teachings in Gurbani, but nobody speaks out against that. And then later on, he marries his sons to multiple women and girls, as well, in order to continue the empire building of the family and their kind of diplomatic matchmaking. And the only other precedent, we do have some precedents. Guru Gobind Singh had several wives, and I think Ranjit Singh's grandfather, Chatur Singh, had at least 2 wives. But Guru Gobind Singh's marriages, for example, as we understand them, were not marriages officially per se. They were what was known as Jadradani marriages, which was whereby the Guru, people brought daughters to him and asked him to take them into his family fold and to look after them. And we supposedly have it on record that he said that, look, I will not marry them as proper wives, but I will take care of them. So the notion of Jadradani is literally to throw a veil over them, to say that he will accept them as women that he would protect, right, as part of the family. And those women play very important roles in the initial kind of transition period after Guru Gobind Singh's death to the rise of the Gurmata assemblies in Amritsar, Mata Sahib Kaur and others, for example. And similarly, this is the notion that Ranjit Singh engages in all these Jadradani marriages when he goes off and conquers different territories in the Punjab and takes the wives of former, conquered kings into his dynasty. But that's not all he's doing, quite clearly, I mean, especially the first 3 or 4 Sikh wives that he marries are definitely political marriages. He has children with them. Mora, of course, Gul Begum, of course, are full, romantic marriages in some sense of the word. And so again, there's a shift there, isn't there, in the sort of power relations and the notion of what a Sikh king or Sikh man can do. And it's only him that does it, as far as we know, and his family. But then I would be very curious to see, actually, if within a sort of a lower level of landed elite, whether these practices also change. But we haven't got that far yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good opportunity to segue into discussion about the role of the queens in the political everyday life of the kingdom. I mean, you talk about in your book how, queens and royal officials are being involved in all matter of things, being, ranging from the administration of various estates. Mainakayan, I believe, is building palaces with these elaborate paintings. And you mentioned how later on, even someone like Rani Jindan is helping potentially establish a new city, right? Dalipgarh, which is remarkable. I mean, you think about it in the Indian tradition, how many women do we know of who played a role in establishing or playing an important role in establishing a particular city? I mean, one can't think of many. So, could you tell us a little bit more about, what role these women were playing in the everyday life of administering this growing kingdom?
Well, this is one of the things that I just found remarkable, as I was going through, and this is, as I mentioned at the start of the interview, that shifted my attention from just Jindgore alone to all of these women. And once I had compiled my my spreadsheet of all the names and dates and whatnot, I started building just a list, I guess, a really long Word document. Everyone's getting to see how I use my computer tools now, with all the references to this Maharani was on this administrative tour, or sent cannons to this military campaign, or was commissioning artists for this fort to be redecorated. They were busy women at the end of the day, and there were 30 wives within Ranjit Singh's immediate, household. And then at least 5 or 6 others for some of the other princes, his sons and grandsons. And that number was only going to grow with time had the family stayed on the throne. And I think one one thing that I took a lot of inspiration from Ruby Lal's work on domesticity in the Mughal Empire, which was a really, really important and valuable contribution to the kind of gender history of our historiography, but also just a useful benchmark for a study that really, I guess, challenges notions of the harem or the zanana as being this closed off, insular, very debauched space, right? That exists so much, so powerfully within colonial and Orientalist studies of women and in India and the Middle East. And that is a trope that, and a set of kind of images that pervade the earlier writing on, especially Maharani Jind Kaur, so much. And so when I initially, as an undergraduate, was looking at the Maharani's politics for a thesis that explored the gender history of her reign, I was curious about how her kind of reputation is split down the lines of mother of the Sikhs, this kind of, very romantic heroine, and literally as a whore. The British kind of, especially many British colonial sources, portray her as this woman who is having affairs left, right, and centre. Her whole power is based on her sexual influence, and that she just has got sex on the mind constantly and cannot function, as a rational human being, and that therefore she has to be removed because she's got this terribly corrupting influence on the Darbar and on her son. And and it was a completely intense disparity, right, in the Punjabi and Sikh accounts and British accounts. But then even within Punjabi accounts, there's a split between the 1840s, the the First Anglo-Sikh War, and afterwards, where in some of the really one famous poem, the Jungnama, which was written by a poet called Shah Muhammad, he blames the Maharani, and he blames her older counterpart Jand Kaur, who was the wife of Gorak Singh, for the downfall of the Khalsa and the Ranjit Singh's kingdom. And he says that there are these two power-hungry women, and that women are always to blame for any kind of political fallout that happens, right? And that they were the reason, because the Maharani's brother was killed by the Sikh troops just before the war, that she sought vengeance, and this, that, and the other. And you see some of those very misogynist stories crossing over into British colonial sources and then being amplified. But that wasn't the case for all of those Punjabi sources, if you see what I mean. There was very much more of a mixed picture. And as I delved then into the British kind of more private political sources, the secret documents that were sent as intelligence records from the Punjab to, senior governors and that kind of thing, within those you see actually, British officials on the ground credited the Maharani with a lot more sense. They saw her as a very interesting and competitive political player, and someone that they had to work with very carefully. But the narrative that then gets spinned in more public government documents, so for example, letters that get presented to Parliament to justify this war, other public accounts that are published in newspapers and in the Houses of Parliament's records, and the kind of formal letters that are sent back to London, to the India office, the India board, sorry, those present a very much more selective picture, shall we say, because the company, and as you put it into context, you realise that the heads of the company were going to have to justify this very, very expensive war with the Sikhs, because it doesn't go very well, essentially. They very nearly lose to the Khalsa army in 1845. So there's this kind of backward step that is taken, and Jind Kaur's character takes a real bashing in that process, I think, as I kind of found when I put this all together. And then you have the arrival of a guy called Henry Lawrence as the resident at the Lahore Darbar, and he is a fascinating but quite problematic figure, in that he has all of these ideas for reforming Indian princely states to make them a more, as for example, Dada Mai Naraji, as you all know, Dinyar would have had later on, to make them a vehicle to keep them, quite importantly, but to make them a vehicle for a different kind of India, essentially a more modernized one. And And he has an entirely negative view of Indian women's rule completely from wherever it is. It's amazing that he tolerates Queen Victoria being on the throne, to be quite honest. And so much of it, so much of this muddies the waters for our understanding of these women. But when you peel back some of these layers, firstly on Jind Kaur, you realize actually she was a really important political player. So, she was trying to set up this town, as you mentioned, the Lipgarh, to raise more revenues for the coffers of the state in order to pay off the war indemnity that was imposed on the Lahore state after the First Anglo-Sikh War. And then you think, well, hang on, as you said, how is she doing this? How does she feel like she has the authority as a woman to do this? Well, it's all there in the fact that she was the junior queen of these 30 wives and had grown up essentially amongst all these other more senior women who, Mine again, for example, who had her own fort at Shekhupura that was captured for her by Garak, which she has, as I mentioned, earlier in the conversation, but you can see it more fully in the book. We have photographs of all of these stunning paintings that she had commissioned by Bahari artists that represent her family's rulership, that represent her relationship with her son and the gurus and all this kind of stuff. And so she's got her own estate. Gul Begum and Mora have their own estates. Actually, the whole notion then of these, reclusive, debauched, sexual networks, this harem essentially, is completely exploded. And you realize that one, not only did these women all actually not live in the same place, some of them lived in Lahore, but actually a lot of them lived all over the Punjabi countryside. And you think Ranjit Singh must have had to put the work in to go and visit them all, which he does. There are records that he does do so. But also they have their own servants, their own officials who are going to administer these territories for them. They draw revenues from those estates. They have to pay tribute to the Darbar, tax essentially on that wealth, but they also use it for patronage, for the arts, for religion, for education, to adopt children and that kind of thing. And those who are mothers of sons have a particularly important role. So Mine again is the kind of premier example of this. She directly is involved in the education of Garak Singh and the preparation of him for the throne, and that was what I found the most fascinating in a way. How she gets involved in military campaigns where he is sent off as the nominal, ambassador, the nominal general, and she is sending military supplies to him. She's going up to Multan, for example, to supervise affairs. And Ranjit Singh asks her, he deputizes her to go and do this alongside very experienced generals from his army who go with Garak Singh to support him, to teach him, etc. And then later on in life, Garak is leading some of these campaigns himself. And just a lot of this stuff just flies under the radar, I think, in much Sikh and Punjabi history writing of this period. Because what we've tended to see is a kind of over focus on the greatness of Ranjit Singh or the greatness of certain other generals like Hari Singh Nalwa, for example, who are almost mythologized, as these superhero characters. And so much of these layers of colonial propaganda that do down the queens or consider Garak Singh to be an imbecile means that we don't take these people seriously. They're just written off before we've had a chance to look at them. And it's not to say that I want to resurrect them as some sort of generation of heroes that we've missed out on. It's not like that, but it's just that we take them into account as interesting human figures, right? And there's actually spades of evidence there to show that they play these very interesting roles. But what is important to note is they are all subordinated to Ranjit Singh. No one is able to displace him, and you see that most powerfully in his relationship with his mother-in-law, Sada Kaur.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if you wanted to discuss her a bit more.
Well, you're the best person to talk about it. But again, I mean, it's striking that Sada Kaur really kind of helps him enter Lahore in the first place, right?
That's right. Yeah. Without his mother-in-law, to be quite honest, Ranjit Singh would have been nowhere. Without his mother and his mother-in-law, I should say, Raj Kaur. Because the two of them, I think this is some of the things that I find the most fascinating. Raj Kaur and Sada Kaur you would be surprised to think that they arranged the marriage of their children, Ranjit Singh and Mehtab Kaur, when they do, right? In the end of the, at the start of the 19th century, because their husbands had been at war with each other, just within a few years of this taking place. And Maha Singh, Ranjit Singh's father, had killed Sada Kaur's husband, right, in battle. So you can't think that there must have been so much acrimony between the two houses, the two missals. But Sada Kaur, from the Kanhaiya missal, recognizes the value of aligning with the Sukrachakiyas, Ranjit Singh's missal, their clan. And it's interesting that she is herself chosen to be the head of the Kanhaiya missal after her husband is killed, despite the fact that he has two brothers who could easily take over. She is regarded as the leader. And similarly for Ranjit Singh's family, his mother Rajgaur takes the reins of the missal and kind of supervises things until he comes of age. So these women set this awful bad blood aside to arrange the children's marriage and come together. And Sada Kaur not only does that, but as you mentioned, she goes when Ranjit Singh is 19 years old to help him conquer Lahore when he receives a summon from many of the Muslim bankers of the city to say, please come and throw these other Sikh rulers out, the Bungis. And they do it, and they manage to conquer it. And not only that, but he's supported by troops from the Nagai family, so Mai Nagen's family, who he's just married into. So without these two in-law families, without these wives and mothers and everything else, he just wouldn't have got anywhere near Lahore, to be quite honest. But not only that, and this is the part I found the funniest, he successfully conquers the fort. And as I mentioned in the book, he starts looting. He allows his troops to start looting the city. And Sada Kaur is like, what are you doing? This is a ridiculous, stupid thing to do. You're going to turn everyone against you. And, he's just kind of drunk on the high of victory and wants to celebrate in a way, and wants to push the Bungis out of the center of the fort as soon as possible. And she says, no, we need to negotiate a settlement that's honorable for all sides. And this harks back to that older culture of, within Sikh politics and diplomacy, of respecting each other as equals in a way, and treating each other as fellow members of the Khalsa, even if you're at war with each other, right? And so she finds a way to ease them out and gives them some grants of land and stuff and sends them on their way honorably. But had Ranjit Singh been left to his own devices, I think he would have been expelled from Lahore, or there would have been a very fraught battle fought that day that would have led to perhaps a draw in a way, right? And so she's fundamental to the building of his power. But what's interesting is that clearly Sada Kaur was aiming at a power sharing situation, right? That not for her son-in-law to become the Maharaja and the overall conqueror of Punjab, but actually for their two dynasties to rise together and kind of share that power in the region. And Ranjit Singh does not want that at all. And eventually he puts his mother-in-law under house arrest. And when her daughter Mehtab Kaur produces him two sons, Sher Singh and Tara Singh, he turns those sons against their grandmother and tells them that, take her territory for yourselves. He doesn't give them land himself or jobs. He asks them to take over her territory, and they do. And poor Sada Kaur, dies a very angry, broken-hearted woman on her estate after having, created to the rise of what we now call the Lion of Punjab. So, this is what I wanted to show with this book, that Ranjit Singh is this very interesting, powerful figure in our history, but without the women in his life, I think it would have been a very different story.
Yeah, and in many ways, Ranjit Singh's as the mother of all mother-in-law relationships with with regard to Sada Kaur. It's incredibly complex, and I think one thing your book really helps do is explode the notion, as you said, of the zenana being this kind of enclosed place that was divorced from the rest of the society in a particular kingdom, and really show how women really were a dynamic aspect of rule, and in not just the Sikh kingdom, but in many other political entities throughout South Asia. I think you're absolutely correct in talking about how you have this kind of trope of derangement that is brought out in so many sources, increasingly so many more of the British sources towards the end of the 19th century, that's used as a justification for getting rid of particular princely rulers or annihilating princely states altogether, right? I mean, you see this in Baroda, you see this in Mysore, you see this with regard to Awadh. And one really wonders when you go through these salacious accounts, I mean, how much of this is hearsay, how much of this is reputable, and how does it stack against what's actually happening? So, as we come to the end of this podcast, the two questions I want to ask you, and one is, how does study of the Sikh Empire, and particularly what you've talked about in terms of the role of women and heirs, and how it's more than just obviously just the kingly figure, how does it help us reconceptualize and understand in different ways the broader history of say princely states or successor kingdoms in this period of Indian history? I mean, going all the way from the late 1700s all the way to the early 20th century, if we can, when we have from the breakup of the Mughal Empire through the consolidation of so many princely states within India. What does the Sikh Empire tell us about these dynamics?
Well, I think, it's a really brilliant question. And I think, it's, for me, the thing I was always struck by is just how fluid and how creative the politics are in this period of history, particularly within the Sikh Empire, but just more broadly in South Asia, in this kind of decline of the Mughal period that we face from, as you said, from at least the 1700s, as Aurangzeb's rule crumbles through to the 19th century, right up until 1857, with and thereafter, when the company takes on the mantle of Bahadur Shah. I think it's this notion of kingship and the Darbar being such an important pair of institutions within South Asian history, from the medieval period to, as well, definitely the more modern still. I don't say it's, we wouldn't say, I think we both agree that it's gone. But I think what is most interesting about the kind of 18th and 19th century, it challenges the older notion. And it came back around again in William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, a very obviously commercially successful book, that the 18th, 19th century is a period of chaos, or as he calls it, the anarchy. And I know he drew on some Mughal era sources, especially Mughal noble sources that describe it as an anarchy. But I have to disagree. I mean, that yes, there is chaos happening. There's wars, there's lots of new kingdoms and powers and entities struggling for power and competing for power. And many ordinary people all over the subcontinent suffer as a result. But this is also a period in which many more different kinds of people, because of the breakdown of the Mughal Empire and the Maratha Empire as well, to a degree, that how things all fracture all over the subcontinent, how some of these bigger entities, it opens up space for all these new political ideas to come to the fore again. And it's not to say that they're entirely brand new, because I think, even if we look at Sikh political thought and the gurus, they are drawing on older lineages of Bhakti, Hindu ideas, or Sufi theology and that kind of stuff, right? And they're refashioning them in different ways. And that's similarly going on in other parts of India. But you see space for women to get involved. You see space for kind of peasant warriors to rise to the position of kingship, especially in Punjab. And with them, they bring new notions of what it means to be a warrior, what it means to be a ruler, the kind of ways, the dynamics in which they interact with their new subjects, as well as taking the trappings of Mughal royal courtly culture and older Indo-Persianate culture. Because also there's a tendency, right, to see Mughal courtly culture as this fixed thing. But of course, as we know, from Babur's time to, Bahadur Shah's, it evolved, right, considerably. And actually, when we look at work on Babur's reign and we look at the role of women in that period, right, all the way through to, say, Akbar's time, Barbara's sisters and mothers and aunts and, various, and some of his wives were also very active in the politics of their time, because Barbara himself was, like Ranjit Singh, in quite a vulnerable position at times, And so, I mean, as Ruby Lal's argued, Gulbuddin Begum wrote the history of one of the histories of his Babur's reign, right, and his rise to power in India. And so, without the source of that lady's history, we would miss a crucial dimension of the rise of Mughal power in India. And one wonders, if the Sikh Empire had survived, would women have continued to play such an important role? Because of course it only lasts for 50 years, right? I don't know whether that necessarily would have continued, or whether the role of women would have become more cloistered and shut down over time. I just don't know. Especially if it had continued as a princely state under British control. As you rightly said, women are sidelined from power in those kingdoms. But in the artistic production, in the design of new buildings, in the evolution of military apparatuses, the armies that modernize and take on different types of European fighting tactics and weapons and that kind of stuff, there's so much fluidity that takes place, so much creative innovation that takes place. But all of it is built on a playfulness of this culture that has been inherited from an older Indo-Persianate tradition of what it means to be a king, right? And what is also fascinating is that no one stops looking to the Mughals in a way. They, of course, as we know, the Mughal seat at Delhi continues until 1858, right? And they remain the benchmark in many ways for understanding the hierarchies of all of these new successor states. So where do they all fit in relation to the Mughal Darbar in Delhi, right? There's that conversation going on. Ovid, Bengal, many of them are spin-offs from the Mughal Empire, right? And they still hark back to or gesture at playing lip service to the Mughal Gaddi. Similarly, Ranjit Singh, when he talks about who are the East India Company, he's trying to figure out where they fit in this hierarchy of powers in South Asia. He's like, well, who is your king? That's how he understands it. Is it the Mughals, or is it the one back in England somewhere, right?
He almost could have used his own Excel spreadsheet. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. Right? No, it's true, right? Or some kind of who's who guide to the British. And so, everything is configured using them as a benchmark in some ways. Although Ranjit Singh then says he eclipses them, right, by taking on the Kohinoor, by taking over all of these Mughal forts and reclaiming them, and then looking at the Gurus as the ultimate rulers, not the Mughals by any means. And that's where you see a really interesting rewriting of Sikh history in the 18th century, and the early 19th century. For example, when I reference the work of Ratan Singh Pangu in one of the early chapters of the book, who he says when he's engaged in a dialogue with the British about, where do the Sikhs fit within, the British are looking at the Sikhs and saying, where do you fit within the power networks of South Asia? Were you not once ruled by the Mughals? And are you not then upstarts against Mughal sovereignty in some ways? And Pangu argues that no, actually Guru Nanak blessed Babur with sovereignty and said that as long as your family remain loyal to the Sikh Panth, then you will flourish. Until when you stop doing that, then you will go into decline. And Pangu charts this history that says, when Aurangzeb starts to persecute the Sikhs, that's when everything falls into disarray for his family, and things decline from there. So it's fascinating how this older, Mughal, but actually very recent Mughal history and culture is reshaped and rebranded for new purposes. And of course, the East India Company does that actively once they exile Bahadur Shah and take over. And how we're still doing it today at, Rashtrapati Bhavan and all these kind of places.
Of course.
Yeah, and I think, and that goes back to that earlier conversation we were having about how important it is to kind of really delve into these dynamics, because to consider this period as just chaos or somehow an area of political fragmentation and stagnation is, I think, to fall into that colonial trap of everything before the British or potentially before around the Mughals is just this empty period of history that the British came to fill in order to bring India into the modern age. That's a trap that we should not fall into anymore.
It's amazing how long and how strong that legacy has been, that particular idea of Britain somehow freeing India of the chaos that ensued after Mughal rule. I mean, you see it repeated. I mean, I see it repeated day in and day out in classroom interactions I have, and of course, it's pervaded so much of the popular literature, at least. So, the last question I want to ask you is in relation to your next project. I know I've talked to you separately about your work on Dalip Singh, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you have in mind in producing, I believe, a biography, right, on Dalip Singh.
Yes. So I am now, I will be starting in January on researching and writing this in earnest. And yes, I will be, a tentative working title that I have is The Lost King. And the reason I chose that title, and let's see if it ends up definitely being that title down the line, but I chose it for two reasons. One, because of the ways in which he, as the last Maharaja who, had his kingdom taken away from him at the age of 10, is mourned by many Sikhs and Punjabis as a lost king and as sort of symptomatic of this lost sovereignty, of this golden era of Punjabi history that we've been talking about today. And there's all this kind of nostalgic, tragic mythology about, how he's pushed into converting into Christianity and taken away from Punjab, never allowed to come back, and how he tries later on to recapture his lost kingdom, but then also fails due to the perfidy of the British, all this kind of dramatic story. But I think I want to add another dimension to this of him as a lost king, as a mentally lost king, as in someone who loses their way and tries to, through all of the, events that take place in his early life, and is trying throughout his life to make sense of it all. But how he identifies most of all with his identity as a king, right? As his status as a king. And what I want to delve into in the book is why he is so fixated on being a king. And, again, you mentioned about the notion of derangement, within the way the British write about Indian princes, and they use that to sort of actually remove them from power. Dalip Singh in some accounts is seen as deranged, as the mad Maharaja, for aspiring to try and reclaim his kingdom later on, right? And it's portrayed as he's this kind of lunatic Oriental who is really spoiled, really self-entitled, and won't just be happy with living out a quiet life on a country estate once he's been deposed, right? But the second half of my doctoral thesis, the first half was on the rise and fall of the Sikh Empire, Royal Punjab. The second half was on Royal Britain. And as I'm sure you know, Dinyar, you can pack a lot into those thesis chapters. But I'm now...
You definitely can, yes.
I'm now unpacking the second half of that thesis and expanding it out with more research and looking at the position that Dalip Singh occupied in the court of Queen Victoria once he's deposed from Punjab. He turns up in Britain age 16, and Queen Victoria is just fascinated with him and kind of adopts him under her wing. And then the position that he settles in Britain as this kind of landed gentleman, member of the British aristocracy, and sets up a home for himself and his family in Norfolk. And what I'm finding really is that, he probably would have lived that quiet life had it not been for Queen Victoria, and how she draws him into the web of royal and courtly politics in her time, and how she is navigating her evolving role, in a monarchy that is now increasingly being subject to challenge from constitutional and calls for constitutional and democratic reform in Britain itself, in Europe itself, which, as in the 19th century, a big part of that history is the rise of more radical movements, calls for democracy, calls for the extension of the franchise and that kind of thing. And how the monarchy is responding to this, but how they also see the empire as a new field for expansion and for keeping the monarchy relevant and keeping its power alive, essentially, and how India is at the heart of this for her and her husband, Prince Albert. And so Dalip Singh, when he turns up at the age of 16, is the first Maharaja to visit Britain. And as a Christian convert, he's even more interesting, And so Queen Victoria and Albert take him under their wing for a specific purpose. And I think that purpose was to really bring alive their new ideas about experimenting with creating a royal role for themselves in relation to India, through engaging with him and other Indian visitors that come to Britain, and to imagine what that royal role could be for them. And in that sense, it means that he cannot stop being royal, right? Because he's their link man in a way, and they want their own royalty to continue. They want Indian royalty to continue, and they want to have their own imperial connection, much like the Mughals had, and Victoria brings this to life as the Empress of India. And so what I want to do is, Dalip Singh turns up in Britain in 1854. 1857, of course, is the rebellion, and then 1858 is the passage of Queen Victoria's proclamation, in which she takes over, the authority of the company, and later on, 20 years later, is proclaimed the Empress of India, Kaiser-e-Hind, as they weirdly begin to call her. But Dalip Singh is crucial to that time period, for being there, for helping her to start represent India at her darbar. And what the book will think about is, what impact does this have on Dalip Singh? If we actually we look at that context a bit more seriously, what impact does that have on Dalip Singh? And what impact does that have on his idea of himself, his idea of his notion of sovereignty, his status in the world? And what does that tell us more broadly then about how monarchy worked in this period? It's obviously not going away. It's obviously not dying quietly. It's wanting to fight and have its own imperial expansion. And for me, the other big question is, what does this mean for then his rebellion? Which we tend to think of as the prodigal son in popular Punjabi Sikh history, the prodigal son wanting to return home. But actually, what I want to think about is, how much is he Queen Victoria's Frankenstein, as well as a product of his upbringing as a Sikh prince, seeking definitely to return to the fold, but as this hybrid now figure, trying to restore Indian royals to power and kick out the British Raj in the end of the 19th century. So I'm hoping it will be an interesting read for everyone, but I'm going to spend the next 2 years working through this and writing it up. And I welcome questions and suggestions from people that listen to this and want to talk about it, because it will help me put it together over time.
That sounds excellent, and I'd encourage you to consider Queen Victoria's Frankenstein as a book title. That sounds like something that would really be quite fitting to the many things you're talking about. So
that just
thank you so
came to
much.
my mind now. That just came to my mind now, and
I think that would be an excellent title to have. Yeah. So thank you, Priya, for being here today and talking to us about your book. I mean, for me, it was really a great thing to read, because I myself know very little about the history of Punjab. So I learned a lot, and I really encourage other listeners to go out and read this book, not just to learn about Punjab, but to learn about the role of women and other individuals who've been, more often than not, kind of washed out of historical record, and regard the true role that they played in sustaining a great empire of the 19th century. So thank you for being here. Thank you for telling us about the history of this empire.
Thank you for having me.
You were listening to Past Imperfect, a special podcast series by SPJIMR, brought to you by SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom in Leadership, produced by Vinita Dwivedi.